Thank you for the invitation, and I would like to start my presentation now. All right, so the title of this talk is Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, Racism and the Species Concept. Seem to work. All right, so I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. My first book on the topic is entitled The Emperor's New Clothes, which was published in 2001. And The Race Myth came out 3 years later in 2004. Now, The Emperor's New Clothes was a book about the history of racial thinking in the Western world. And The Race Myth was a book that assumed that you understood that history and then went on to examine the ongoing pathologies in the United States, but also throughout the world, which result from racial thinking. Now, I honestly thought after The Race Myth that I would never have to write another book about race and racism from the point of view of biology and genetics. But the world moved on, and America found itself in the grips of what I would call now a racial crisis, beginning in the mid-2010s. And so I spoke with my colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman, a former president of the American Anthropological Association, and we agreed that there was a need for a new book to address these ongoing misconceptions about human biological variation and conceptions of race. And so we collaborated on Racism, Not Race, which was published in December 7th of 2021. The book rapidly gained recognition. It was named as one of the best nonfiction books published in the United States in 2021. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this long discussion, which I'm going to talk about in this lecture, here are some additional sources. The Race Are We So Different website, which is associated with the Race Exhibition, which travels around the United States. This was put together by the American Anthropological Association. A series of essays published in 2005 that still are quite relevant. Is Race Real? From the Social Science Research Council. The 3-part documentary from the California newsreel called Race, Power, and Illusion, which I believe is still the best documentary on this subject ever produced. I appear in both parts 1 and part 3, talking about biological variation and how it doesn't associate itself with our social definitions of race. And finally, the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, the second edition, which came out in 2013. I was the editor for all of the genetics evolution entries in that encyclopedia. And again, it is still a very valuable reference tool even today, 10 years later. So today's talk is going to follow a paper that was just published by the Cold Spring Harbor Symposium on Speciation. The title of that paper is Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, Racism and the Speciation Concept. Now, you may hear social scientists utter this platitude: race is not a scientific concept. Now, you'll often find folks who really don't know the history of the idea saying this. And the problem with this concept, or the statement, which is absolutely wrong, is that it conflates two different concepts. That is the biological race concept, which has its own history, and the socially defined or socially constructed race concept, which has its own history. Now, the two clearly interacted with each other, and I will talk about that throughout this talk, but you cannot treat them as if they're the same thing. Now, another misconception that people have looking back from the now 21st century is thinking that biology in the Western world began on an evolutionary foundation, which is in fact also completely and thoroughly wrong. Biology in the Western world began in the framework of special creationism, particularly in the context of Christianity. And so when folks began to look at nature from those lenses, they were attempting to classify and make sense of living things in the context of a special creation event which had occurred relatively recently in history. Now, things moved on to the 19th century. So this was pretty much the dominant idea that dominated biology for 200 years. And moving from just the physical attributes of living things to where they were found. Okay. And so we don't actually begin to get evolutionary conceptions of race until the latter portion of the 19th century. And this really comes forward in the 20th century, both with the utilization of the criterion or population-based criteria, such as the frequency of genes in groups within a species, or whether any group within a species can be considered an evolutionarily unique lineage. Now, another thing I want to speak to you about concerning the biological race concept is that this concept can be applied to any species that has biparental inheritance. And so that is one of the reasons why you can't conflate biological race thinking with that of socially constructed or socially defined race thinking, which only applies to human beings. So the socially defined race concept arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. That is precisely why Alan and I named our book Racism, Not Race, because it points out the fact that the way race is lived in the modern world, and that's not just in the United States, not just in Europe, but also the rest of this planet, operates in the service of social dominance. That is the only reason that this concept exists. And it came into existence in the 15th century in conjunction with the transatlantic slave trade. And it has been carrying out this role of the oppression of people based upon these socially defined characteristics, which are both historically contextual and culturally contextual since that time. Now, I'm going to go take you through a very quick timeline, and certainly in the course of this, discussion, I can't possibly do justice to all of these events, but I put this out here so that you have a sense of how these ideas developed through time. So we'll start with the 1300s, in which both Marco Polo and the Islamic scholar Ibn Battuta traveled the world. Ibn Battuta traveled from North Africa to China, and in his writings, he never describes people as racist. So he'll talk about the people that he came in contact with. He'll talk about their physical attributes and how they differed, but he never talked about them as discrete biological entities. Now, in the 15th century, Pope Nicholas V gave Portugal the right to conduct the African slave trade. And we also have Columbus arriving in the Caribbean on his way to find a sea route to India. And shortly after that, those set of events, we begin to see what's the word I'm looking for? It's the expansion of ideas to explain the diversity of the new people Europeans are coming in contact with. So, for example, Paracelsus, a Swiss physician, came up with the notion of the pre-Adamite races, in which he claimed only Europeans were the descendants of Adam and Eve, and all of the other people on the planet were produced by the pre-Adamite races. In other words, the Christian God had created different pairs to give rise to the different races on the planet. 200 years later, we have Carolus Linnaeus, who was writing Systema Naturae, which is a discussion of the species and varieties on the planet. Now, one has to be aware of the fact that up until this point, the notion that varieties were really real in biology was something that was highly disputed. So Linnaeus begins writing on this, mainly classifying plants and other organisms, and beginning to recognize that you simply couldn't ignore variation in nature. But Linnaeus does not discuss variation in humans until his 10th edition. And so while he is responsible for talking about, in a hierarchical way, 4 varieties of human beings: Homo sapiens europaeus, Homo sapiens asiaticus, Homo sapiens americanus, and Homo sapiens afro, in which he ranked Africans as the lowest form of the human species, that was not his purpose when he began this work on Systema Naturae. Now, through the 18th century, naturalists disagreed on whether a hierarchical ranking of the human races was possible. They also disagreed as to whether the differences they saw in humans were the result of inheritance or genetics, or whether they were the result of environmental causation. There were many naturalists who thought that if Africans stayed in the temperate zones for a long enough period of time, that their skin would begin to lighten within the same generation, which is different from lightening over a very long period of time due to natural selection. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was the first consistent evolutionary scientist, saw races as distinct lineages at different levels of perfection. Now, again, one must understand that Lamarck is a special creationist. Lamarck felt that God had created different types, and those types had an innate capacity to improve themselves, and that this improvement occurred via the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, we see a very different pattern in the 19th century. Now, naturalists, and again, these people are European or American. So this is not a discussion of what people were thinking in Asia, nor is it a discussion of what people were thinking in other portions of the world. But they now uniformly agree on African inferiority. They also now agree on the heritability of racial traits, meaning that these are genetic. But they also place this in the context of the pre-Adamite races. So they are not evolutionary biologists. They believe that God created different types for different geographical zones on the planet with different first pairs, different in Adam and Eve for Africa, different Adam and Eve for Asia, different Adam and Eve for the Americas, and so on, and that their traits had been specially created for the conditions in which they inhabited. Now, the main scholars of this in the United States were Louis Agassiz, Swiss-born naturalist; Samuel Morton, considered America's greatest man of science before Agassiz arrived; Josiah Nott; and the Englishman George R. Gliddon. I call them the 4 horsemen of polygeny in The Emperor's New Clothes. So, one of the ways that the polygenists ranked human beings were by physical traits. So Petrus Camper, for example, ranked human beings based upon skull angles. So in this comparison, you have the profile of a Negro and of a European compared to that of an orangutan. And the European shows a right angle for their skull, and the African shows a acute angle. Now, why a right angle should be somehow superior to any other angle, I have never figured out the logic behind that. I seriously still to this day can't figure out why you would think that any specific facial angle is somehow superior to another. But you will also note in the drawing of the orangutan how human-like this orangutan looks relative to humans, which is, again, part of the lack of understanding of primate diversity, which was present in the 18th century. Now, By the time we get to the 19th century, the species question, which is whether species were mutable in the history of life, was the greatest intellectual endeavor of the time in biology. And it was also the greatest scientific revolution that has occurred in biology. Now, Charles Darwin would provide an answer which would change forever how we think about both the biological as well as the social sciences. Okay, and as I pointed out in the last slide, Darwin was not the first evolutionist in Western science, and that honor, of course, goes to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, while most comparisons of Lamarck and Darwin revolve around the mechanism of inheritance, there's also another profound difference. Again, Lamarckians saw all species types as being imbued with an innate capacity for improvement. Thus, Lamarckian evolution predicted that species lineages were fixed and separate from each other. So in Lamarckian evolution, you would never have seen, Darwinian adaptive radiation. In other words, the number of species lineages were fixed at the beginning of time. Species could change within a lineage, but you would never see species expanding in the number of species or contracting, because they also thought that extinction wasn't possible. Now, they also saw human races in the context of the endowment of perfection. And for them, some races had progressed less. Now, in this slide, I show an image which we call the icon of progression, which is still very popular around the world when people discuss evolution. And here you see different species progressing towards a more advanced type, but that is not, in fact, how natural selection works. That's not how descent with modification works. Okay, humans and chimpanzees, humans are not descended from chimpanzees. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor in the past that was neither a chimpanzee or was it a human. So here's a quick summary of some of the views of 18th century naturalists with regard to the racial traits of the Negro. And what you'll note is that there is no consensus. So Bonnier, von Leibniz, and Blumenbach, considered the father of anthropology, did not think that you could objectively rank human races. Camper, Buffon, and Miners thought you could. They also were not in an alignment with regard to whether the traits were heritable or whether they were the result of the environment. But they did all agree that there was only one human species. And this view was called monogeny. That is, one pair, Adam and Eve, which gave rise to all of the humans on the planet. Now, by the mid-19th century, Charles Lyell, who was the founder of uniformitarian geology, which most of you in the audience know is an important worldview with regard to how evolution works, okay, had all sorts of, should we say, discomfort with the implications of his protege, Charles Darwin's species theory. And he clearly understood the implications of common descent. Here's a quote from Lyell. "Go back umpteen generations, and would blacks and whites find a common ancestor, itself the descendant of an ape? The idea would give shock to nearly all men. No university would sanction it, and it would ensure the expulsion of a professor already installed." Now, Darwin himself understood the implications of his ideas. So we're talking about a time in which the race concept and its social implications were at an explosive point in Western society. The Scottish physician Robert Knox had achieved new notoriety by prophesizing the coming of, quote, race wars across the Western world. During the same time period, Louis Agassiz would change his view concerning species and human races, viewing them as separate creations in his zones of creation theory. In 1856, as Darwin was preparing the publication of The Origin, he felt that Agassiz will throw a boulder at me and many others will pelt me. So there's been a great deal of debate about why, when Darwin had all of the information necessary to develop evolution by natural selection, descent with modification in the early 1850s, why it took him so long to publish The Origin. One of those arguments had to do with Darwin's own personality, with the fact that his wife, Emma, was very religious, that he was a close friend of their minister, and he didn't want to upset the church. But one of the main reasons why Darwin didn't rush The Origin to publication was because he understood the implications for English society for common ancestry. He also, for that reason, chose not to talk about human beings in The Origin of Species. And again, that's a common misconception that people have about the book that talks about humans. Humans, there's not an example in the first edition of The Origin that addresses humans directly at all. And he purposely did not include humans so that he could avoid the common ancestry issue. Now, contrasting Agassiz and Darwin, and the reason this is necessary is because at this time, Louis Agassiz was the leading person in American science, and considered to be one of the greatest biologists in the world. So Agassiz's geology was catastrophism. He thought that there were separate creations in each geological epoch. Okay, God wiped out that creation, created something new, and then created another, and so on. Darwin was a uniformitarian. He argued, as Lyell did, that the geological forces changing rock strata on the planet were relatively constant. Okay, anthropocentrism. For Agassiz, humans were the center of creation, per his religious beliefs. Okay, Darwin thought that humans were one of many species and recognized that you couldn't come up with an accurate understanding of living things if you focused on humans alone. For Agassiz, species existed in distinct periods and zones on the planet. For Darwin, species were the result of previously existing species, thus descent with modification. Their political values. Agassiz was strongly conservative. It has been argued by one of his biographers, Christopher Armstrong, that Agassiz purposely inserted himself into the racial disputes in the United States in the 1850s as a way of increasing his value as a public intellectual. On the other hand, Darwin was politically progressive. And again, this is something most people don't know. He is the grandson of Josiah Wedgwood, who was very important in the British Anti-Slavery Society. His grandfather designed the medal, the British Anti-Slavery Society medal. Two of his aunts were activists in the abolitionist movement in the UK. He himself discussed his aversion to slavery and racism in The Voyage of the Beagle, which was the voyage which gave him the ideas about natural selection and evolution. And he continues being relatively progressive in the 19th century throughout his entire life. Now, don't get me wrong. If you read his correspondence, as I have, he's not entirely free of the European racism of his age. And he's often criticized by that out of context. But if you put him on the basis of intellectuals in that time period, Darwin definitely comes down on the right side of history. Agassiz was gregarious and public. His lectures were widely attended. In fact, on the tour that brought him to the United States, there were, standing room only. Whereas Charles Darwin was strongly introverted and really didn't like crowds and didn't like the notoriety. Okay, so for Agassiz, human races were separate species. For Darwin, humans saw the human species as only one species, and he, felt that humans were more alike than they were different. Okay, in racial hierarchy, Agassiz thought Europeans were supreme. Darwin thought that the emotion and intellect of human populations were in fact similar. Okay. Now, both of them were abolitionists, but Agassiz's abolitionism was that of the Jeffersonian Lincoln variety, which was abolishing slavery for the purpose of removing persons of African descent from the United States. Agassiz had a strong aversion to Black bodies. He did not like seeing them, and he felt that America should be a white country. Darwin was for the purpose of abolition because slavery was an immoral institution, period. Now, in the 19th century, the science of the day, as I said, shifted. If you look at naturalists talking about Africans and Europeans, they all thought that the differences were genetic. They all think that Africans are inferior. They all think that Africans were a separate species. Now, I also want to point out that, and this is a reminder that, biology was still on a creationist foundation in the middle of the 19th century. So in March of 1850, Agassiz attended Josiah Nott, who was a South Carolina physician and slaveholder, lectures on the genealogy of the human race. He argued, quote, that there's not a particle of proof, and this is not, that the different human races share the same family tree. So this is polygeny. Agassiz supports Nott's contention by offering up his own version of the pre-Adamite race theory. Agassiz's remarks on this comment, his comments, were read by Darwin from this meeting that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. And Darwin says this: Agassiz's lectures in the US, in which he has been maintaining the doctrine of several species, much, I dare say, to the comfort of the slave-holding Southerns. In other words, one of the buttresses of American chattel slavery was the idea that Africans were not members of the same species and therefore could be treated like any other chattel. Now, Agassiz goes on a tour of the United States. He visits several slave plantations in South Carolina. He's convinced, based upon his observations, that he can identify the tribal or ethnic origin of the enslaved people that he observed. After his departure, Gibbs arranged for a series of daguerreotypes. These were the first photographs to be made of the enslaved people that Agassiz observed. And here's an example of one of these. Now, the way Agassiz had these portraits taken were to display the individuals as, quote, typical zoological specimens. So I'm showing here one of the daguerreotypes, which, is not really bad, because if you look at them all, you would find that these individuals were really degraded in the way that they were portrayed in this series of pictures. Now, just so you know, these pictures remained in the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography at Harvard for over 100 years before anybody rediscovered them. Now, they were a big feature of my talk when I was asked to give one of the inaugural lectures commemorating 200 years of the Peabody Museum at Harvard back in 2016. So here we are back with our four horsemen, as I mentioned. To speed up this lecture, I'm not going to talk about specifically things that they did, but you can certainly read about them. Okay. Now, it's not as if they were able to put forward their ideas without opposition. So Frederick Douglass, for example, an abolitionist leader, addressed the claims of the Four Horsemen in an essay entitled "The Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered." This was delivered at Western Reserve College. For Americans in the audience, this place is now called Case Western Reserve today. Now, he pointed out that one of the fundamental pillars of polygenism and slavery was the idea that the Negro was not part of the human family. Now, this, by the way, was encoded in American law. So very early on in the establishment of chattel slavery in North America, Okay, laws in the slave states did not distinguish between Negroes and other domestic property, such as animals or chairs. And slaves were considered chattel by law in all of the American slave states by the middle 18th century. And of course, this is reified by the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And in that decision, 9 justices on the Supreme Court, 5 from the slaveholding South, the majority decision was written by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. His main components were, first, Scott was not a citizen. Negroes were inferior to whites, and he based this on the best science of the time, quoting Agassiz, quoting Morton. Okay, Negroes were not differentiated from any other property, cattle or chairs. They could be reduced to slavery for their own benefit. Now, the thing that bothers me the most about Taney's decision is this, that they could be reduced to slavery for their own benefit. Because now in the United States, we have states where they have passed laws that require that this is taught as part of the civil and social studies curriculum. So the state of Florida has passed a law which requires teachers to show that slavery was beneficial to enslaved people. Finally, they have no rights which a white man was bound to respect. So Darwin did come back to this question of human biological variation in his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which was published in 1871. Now, if you want to know why he was able to do this in 1871 and wasn't able to do it in 1859, was because his position in British society and the British scientific community had changed dramatically due to the success of On the Origin of Species. And so therefore, he didn't have to worry about Agassiz or any of those folks anymore. So in chapter 7, Races of Man, he says, the variability of all the characteristic differences between the races before referred to likewise indicates that these differences cannot be of much importance. For had they been important, they would have been eliminated long ago. In this respect, man resembles those forms called by naturalists, protean or polymorphic, which have remained extremely variable owing, as it seems, to their variations being of an indifferent nature and consequently to their having escaped the action of natural selection. Now, those of you in the audience who understand population genetics recognize that Darwin was wrong about this. That, in fact, some of these traits were neutral. Some of them, however, were positively selected, and I'll talk about that later on in the talk. So, Darwin's main arguments against polygeny in The Descent of Man are shown here in this table from my 2023 paper. So first, geographical distribution. Okay, Agassiz's zones of creation did not describe human distribution. It was supported then, and it's supported now. In other words, Agassiz's idea that there were zones of creation for any species simply isn't correct. Physical and mental differences between races, but races were more alike than different. Again, supported now and supported then. Racial characters constants. Characters used to define races were not consistent nor constant within supposed races. And again, that argument was supported then, it's supported now. External parasites, such as lice, were different by race. Okay, that was supported then. We no longer think that that is correct now. Human races show differences in their susceptibility to infectious disease. Okay, that is supported then, supported now. Full interfertility of human races with each other, offspring showed no loss of viability. So the biological species concept requires that this be true. And again, that was supported then. And Darwin, by the way, made that argument based upon the observations of Johannes Bachman, the South Carolina slaveholder, who looked at the crosses, so-called crosses, of Africans and Europeans on his plantation and showed their offspring had no loss of viability. So that's supported then and supported now. So going beyond the publication of The Origin in 1859, in 1864, we see Herbert Spencer's Social Darwinism, which equates fitness with success in laissez-faire capitalism. Now, for those of you listening, there's nothing Darwinian in Herbert Spencer's ideas, which I explain carefully in The Emperor's New Clothes. It has the unfortunate historical name Social Darwinism, but in fact, it's not a Darwinian or evolutionary theory at all. Mendel publishes his work on the principles of particulate inheritance in 1868. And again, an unfortunate side effect of Mendelian genetics was the eugenics movement, which begins with people like Gobineau, Galton, Davenport, and the Nazi race scientists. And its peak was from 1858 to 1940. Now, don't get me wrong, eugenicists still exist in the world today, okay, but they're no longer as popular as they were in the 1920s to the 1940s. Now, from 1900 to 1950, we have the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was the unification of Mendelian genetics and natural selection. And this is led by people like R.A. Fisher, Sewell Wright, J.B.S. Haldane, and many others. So this is a very important event for modern biology, which I'm going to explain in short order. In 1942, we have Ashley Montague's publication of the book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. So to make a long story short, by 1942, there was already enough evidence to demonstrate that humans did not have biological races. And Montague summarizes this in this book published in 1942, by the way, while the US was still segregating blood supplies during a war, since they thought that Black blood or Negro blood would somehow hurt white soldiers. Now, after the war, in which the revelations of Nazi race science become apparent to the world, you get the race statements by the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization. Shortly after that, decade or so, Frank Livingstone publishes The Non-Existence of Human Races in Current Anthropology. Between 1972 and 2000, we have a series of studies, beginning with protein gel electrophoretic studies of human variation, and then DNA marker studies of human variation, demonstrating that there's more genetic variation within so-called racial groups in humans than between them, which means that there are no racial groups. By 2002, we have the publication of the Human Genome by Sanger Technology, but there was a rapid movement to get better technology to sequence genomes, and this occurs between 2006 and 2014, and we now have Illumina sequencing and also third-generation sequencing technology that reduces both the time and cost of genome sequencing. And by 2014, Illumina announced the $1,000 human genome. Finally, from 2014 to the present, ancient DNA studies provide a finer outline of the first human migrations across the planet and their global adaptations. So, I was already talking about the synthesis, so again, I'm going to move on. So, the synthesis also led to some vigorous debates about evolution, genetics, and society. For example, in 1939, the 7th International Congress of Genetics, which was held in Edinburgh, saw a walkout of the German, Hungarian, Scandinavian, and Swiss delegations on the second or third day, precisely around race science. Upon the initial printing of the program, the Russian, then Soviet delegation refused to attend. Now, the report of the Congress included a manifesto authored primarily by American and English geneticists, such as F.I.E. Crew, J.B.S. Haldane, Harland, Hogman, Huxley, and H.J. Mueller. In fact, on the right-hand side, you can see Mueller's handwritten version of the manifesto, courtesy of the University of Indiana H.J. Mueller collection. And in that declaration, they didn't explicitly condemn Nazi race science. nor did it reject eugenical methods. Instead, it called for society to understand how such methods could potentially be used to improve human health, intelligence, temperament. Now, immediately that manifesto grew immediate criticism in the Eugenics Review, authored by Leonard Darwin. And if you guess, Leonard Darwin was Charles Darwin's son. So the critique was that the geneticist manifesto relied too much on social and environmental changes as opposed to genetic ones. Again, shortly after that, we have Montague's publication of Man's Most Dangerous Myth. Now, quickly, in the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, we produce a model of how biological races or subspecies are formed during the process of speciation. And simply, you start out with a population that has high levels of gene flow within it. Then over time, some barrier to gene flow appears. And as a result, if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, which is looking at allopatric speciation, two populations begin to diverge in their allele frequencies as a result of adaptation to different conditions on either side of the mountain range. Now, this can, over time, lead to reproductive isolation, which means, using the biological species concept, that these groups have now become separate species. It's important to recognize that that does not have to happen. In other words, speciation can happen, it doesn't have to. Now, during this process of divergence in allele frequencies, at some point, you can claim that these groups are sufficiently different to be named as biological or geographical races. But to do that, you have to have specific criteria. And so in the beginning of the discussion of speciation, folks studied exactly, how genetic changes could occur relative to specific environments, such as Dobzhansky's observation of changes of inversion frequency by altitude in Drosophila pseudoobscura, and other numerous examples of this across the globe in various different species. Now, by 1946, after the war is over, you have people like Dobzhansky and Dunn writing a popular work, Heredity, Race, and Society, that described why we have biological genetic variation, we really aren't that different. Certainly, Richard Lewontin's initial theoretical exposure to this problem resulted from his training under Dobzhansky at Columbia in 1952 to 1954. Okay. You also have in the same time period the UNESCO statements, and which essentially say that there aren't meaningful genetic differences between human races. The second statement was drafted by a committee that included 5 geneticists and emphasized more the reality of biological race, but that they couldn't be hierarchically ranked. So in 51, Dobzhansky discusses race formation. And again, his main criterion is genetically distinct populations of species are termed geographical races. Subspecies or local varieties. The problem, of course, with this definition is determining exactly how much differentiation constitutes genetic distinctness. Now, he further describes races as Mendelian populations that differ in the frequencies of one or more genetic variants, alleles, or chromosomal structures. Now, Ernst Mayr, 20 years after this, addresses the difficulty with this concept. He says, the concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes or subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn in sexual species consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concept are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomists, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary. Now, Sewell Wright actually gives us or gave us a way to examine genetic distinctness with his population subdivision statistics. So population subdivision is defined as the total heterozygosity of the species minus the heterozygosity of its subpopulations divided by the total heterozygosity of the species. Now, this parameter clearly is bound by 0 if the population heterozygosity and total heterozygosity are the same, then FST is 0. That essentially means that the subpopulations are completely panmictic, have very high levels of gene flow, and are really not differentiated. Now, if population subdivision heterozygosity is extremely small, then you can arrive at FST being 1, meaning that there's strong genetic differentiation between all of the subpopulations, and you really can legitimately claim them as subspecies or geographical races. So we have measured this in a variety of large-bodied mammals. And so if you look at human population subdivision relative to other large-bodied mammals, it's extremely weak. So on this slide, based upon 24 genes, you see human global FST coming in at around 0.156. Now, Wright argued convincingly that you really wouldn't name a biological or geographical race unless FST exceeded the value of 0.250. So in this small study, humans don't exceed that value. But I want to point out, and this is why I make the point that there is a legitimate biological race category. It's just that our species doesn't have them. So if you look at coyotes in North America, they're close to this threshold. Certainly elephants in Eastern and Southern Africa make it. White-tailed deer, Grant's gazelle, gray wolves in Eurasia and North America, all would be legitimately classified as having subspecies or biological races by this criterion, but not humans. And if we look at human genetic variation in a much finer way, at the level of single nucleotide polymorphisms, which of course they couldn't do in that earlier study, then you see that human FST is much, much smaller than that. So looking at 5 different chromosomes in coding regions of the human genome, we find FSTs that are less than 0.103. In the non-coding regions, which are freer to accumulate genetic variation because they don't produce protein, you still don't exceed Wright's FST value of 0.250. Now, neither can we show the existence of distinct clusters in humans using phylogenetic methods. So while there is, isolation by distance in humans, and that we can show that, distance plays a major factor, and that barriers to migration played a factor, such as the Sahara and the Himalayas and the oceans, we still don't arrive at FSTs that exceed Wright's critical threshold of 0.250. And in fact, in this next slide, you can see in the bottom panel that the strongest determinant of FST is geographical distance. And so if you go from the distance between populations in pairwise comparison, what you see is that populations that are closest to each other in geographical distance have the lowest FST. Populations that are further apart in in geographical distance, have the highest FSTs, but these never exceed 0.250, nor are there any breaks, significant breaks, which would indicate clustering of populations with regard to gene flow. And so therefore, the way to understand human genetic variation is that it's continuous across the range of our species, and that we really don't have a legitimate means to delineate human beings into biographical or geographical groups that we would call races. Now, This makes sense given that our species is relatively young, that it spent the majority of its time in Africa before anyone left. So 300,000 years, 200,000 or so was spent in Africa, 100,000 to migrate across the globe, and that this accounts for this pattern of isolation by distance, which you saw in the previous slide. Now, we do have local adaptations. So by using methods like, for example, looking at high regions of FST within the human genome, we can identify areas in which we certainly demonstrate adaptation. But these are things that you would sort of predict. So we have, for example, human pigmentation, which goes from the tropics to the Arctic. We have things like high altitude adaptation, but we find high altitude adaptation in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. We have adaptation to specific parasites, such as malaria. But malaria adaptation goes from southern Spain into tropical Africa, southern Italy, okay, Greece, Saudi Peninsula, all the way over to India, and so on. So what's interesting here, by the way, also is that most of the adaptation we see is facilitated by changes in single genetic loci. There is very few examples of polygenic strong adaptation. For example, height in Northern Europe, and also height in Central Africa, the so-called rainforest phenotype, which we also see in Brazil. But none of this corresponds to socially defined racial groups. And furthermore, what I find extremely interesting is that some of the traits which have been associated with racial supremacy in the past, such as fair complexion, are relative newcomers. So, for example, a 7,000-year-old Mesolithic European shows that they still contained the African alleles or tropical alleles for dark skin. And other ancient DNA results have been showing the same thing with regard to how recent fair skin appears in Northern European and other populations, on the order of 10,000 years for fair skin alleles, for blue eyes, for blonde hair. So in conclusion, modern biological definitions of race are based upon the amount of genetic variation within and between groups, as well as whether any populations within the species can be considered evolutionarily unique. Our species fails those definitions. Isolation by distance accounts for the majority of the variation between human populations. Local adaptation has occurred, but evidence suggests that this is observed in a relatively small number of traits. Certainly, you didn't see 19,000 protein coding genes on the previous slide. Human biological variation does not match socially defined categories. And therefore, as we argue in Racism Not Race, racism has created the categories that currently dominate our social history. That is not the result of human biological variation. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully I still have time to take any questions